Good afternoon and welcome to the Journal Sentinel's first ever video chat. We'll be taking questions about the 2014 general election race last night. I'm Dan Bice. I'm a columnist with the Journal Sentinel. To my left is Craig Gilbert, our Washington correspondent and numbers cruncher extraordinaire. To my right, Bill Glauber. He's a general assignment reporter for the Journal Sentinel, and he probably knows Mary Burke and Scott Walker better than anyone else in the newsroom, or just about anybody else, having written about Scott Walker repeatedly and Mary Burke repeatedly. So let's start off with a simple question. What exactly happened last night?
I think what happened is the Republicans realigned the state and the Democrats just got waxed.
I would not use the word realignment. I think what happened was the voters hit the replay button. I mean, this was the 2010 and 2012 gubernatorial election all over again.
Let's just pick that up for a second before we go to the first question. Do you think that there's anything from this election that should indicate to us that the numbers will be any different in 2016 with the next presidential?
Well, we know they'll be different because the presidential voting patterns have been a lot different in this state in recent cycles. Obviously, the Democrats have won Wisconsin for president in 7 elections in a row, but they've lost the majority of gubernatorial races. So we're in a pattern where the midterm turnout is different from the presidential turnout, and midterms, as a general rule, never predict presidential elections in the following cycle.
Okay, so let's go to our first question. What do you think are Mary Burke's next steps? Would there be any momentum for her to run for the U.S. Senate against Ron Johnson?
I think she's going to recover, spend a few weeks figuring it out, and then figure out where she goes from here. I get a sense it may be a one-shot deal for her politically, but you know, she's got to take some time and figure it out, and then other people will look at Ron Kind and Russ Feingold for that seat.
Feingold for the Senate seat?
For the Senate seat, yeah.
So you see the possibility of a Feingold-Johnson race a second time?
I think it's possible. I also think, you know, Ron Kind is a possibility too, but we're going to find out in a few short months, I think.
What do you think the best race would be, just in terms of competitiveness against Ron Johnson? He's mentioned Ron Kind and Russ Feingold. Either one of those you think would they be equally competitive?
Well, they're different candidates. I mean, Russ Feingold certainly would be a more mobilizing candidate for the Democratic base. Ron Kind, probably a little bit less polarizing and maybe pull in some moderates. But again, our elections have been so polarized that it's not necessarily, the better candidate is not necessarily the more centrist candidate. I think the main thing about that election is that because we're getting a class of senators who got elected in the 2010 midterms, a very conservative year, some of those senators are going to be huge targets for Democrats. Ron Johnson is at the top of that list.
Yeah, he's going to be number one. Okay, another question from a reader. After going 0 for 3 against Scott Walker, should the Wisconsin Democratic Party start thinking about a change in leadership? And I wrote about this morning, saying that one of the big losers last night was Mike Tate. He had everything set up his way. He liked having Mary Burke and Susan Happ at the top of the ticket. He liked the matchups against the 2 Republican people. The only thing is, it just didn't work out. He obviously, there was a pretty devastating rebuke at the polls yesterday, and now they have to deal with the consequences. Do you think it goes as far as getting rid of Mike Tate?
I think Tate may want to go at some point. You know, he's been there, I believe, 6 years. That's a long time to be party chair. I think it will be up to him to a certain degree. I think we're already seeing the possibility of some change in the legislative leadership. So I think that plays itself out in the next few weeks. But if Tate goes, who's next? I mean, really, do they have anybody?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of a problem with the Democrats. There's not anybody there to step into his place. Any thoughts on that?
Democrats clearly have their problems in this state, but it's also not like what happened to Democrats in Wisconsin was any different from what happened to Democrats nationally. I mean, this was just a really bad election for Democrats all around the country. I mean, you saw basically virtually almost without exception, the Republican governors that got elected in 2010 around the country got reelected this time.
But sometimes there are exceptions, like the year that J.B. Van Hollen was elected 8 years ago. he was the exception, and there were particular situations that allowed him to be. In fact, I think he was the only statewide elected official who flipped the office.
Right. And I think we've seen our elections become more nationalized in recent cycles, which is one reason why you're seeing fewer races go against the grain of a national tide, which doesn't mean, it still happens, but it's harder and harder to run against a national tide.
And you wonder if the Democrats have anybody who can step up, not just to be party leader if that's the choice they make, but to step up in some of these bigger roles within the party, within the legislative leadership. They need some new stars and a new generation, and it just hasn't happened for them yet.
Actually, I'm going to skip the next question that I posted and go ahead and jump on to one that just came in, and that is, somebody asked, does Susan Happ have a future, or did the Republicans just kill her in the crib?
Well, that's pretty rough. Yeah, I think she does.
First, what did you think of her as a candidate?
I thought she was a pretty good candidate. She's, the pistol-packing woman who rides a Harley. And, she was very adept at answering questions, and she went out there and did a good job in the debates. She got caught in this tidal wave.
She is a different kind of Democrat than your traditional Madison liberal, which is what they've been running before. And I think that's why people had some hope that she might do particularly well. But in the end, didn't she lose by a larger percentage than even?
I think so, but I don't think the numbers were that different. I don't think she did anything to sort of hurt herself going forward. I think actually the fact that there was speculation that she might run ahead of Mary Burke kind of reflected the perception that she was a pretty decent candidate for Democrats for that office.
She seemed much more comfortable in the position at the debates, both debates.
Mm-hmm.
I thought she did really well at the two debates. And I didn't think Burke did badly. I just think she seemed uncomfortable in the first debate, a little more comfortable in the second debate. But in her case, she's debating someone.
Well, Happ is an attorney. She better be good on her feet, and that's what they pay you to do, and I think she was. I spoke to her before the election, the day before the election, and she told me this isn't the last you've heard of me in a statewide race. So I think she enjoyed the campaigning. She got her name out there. No disgrace in losing a race like that, given it was a wave election, and she may have a future within the Democratic Party.
The next question, is there any chance Wisconsin in the next 4 years will see political upheaval and polarization, or will there be more of the same? What topic is most likely to be among the first flashpoints?
We're so polarized and so divided that, it's sort of natural to wonder, where we're headed. I mean, can it get any more divided and any more polarized? It's hard. I mean, the fault lines are so deep and embedded that it's sort of hard to imagine them from the point of view of today, just sort of suddenly easing or going away. So I think this is kind of where we are as a state. If you look at some of the fault lines in the voting yesterday, some of them were actually even deeper than they were in the first two Walker victories. I mean, we were a little more polarized along party lines. We were a little bit more polarized along gender lines.
Do you think there's anything that Democrats could do to pick up support in these off-year elections, or anything Republicans can do to broaden their appeal during the presidential elections? What are the areas or topics where you think that they can make some inroads?
To me, the biggest problem the Democrats have right now is they are not expanding and speaking to homeowners in a way that Republicans are speaking. When Scott Walker talks about the hardworking taxpayer, he's talking to workers and to homeowners. Now, Democrats may disagree with his policies, but he's talking to average people out there, and the Democrats have not been able to connect with that segment of the population now in these off-year elections.
What would be something they could do to make that connection? Is it focus more on social issues, or I mean, it was something Bill Clinton was able to do, and Reagan was also able to broaden the appeal beyond the traditional base.
And it's a tough needle, a tough needle that you're trying to thread, and I'm not so sure how you do it, but one thing is clear: they aren't succeeding right now. This is, 3 straight elections they've lost to Walker by similar margins. And I mean, they have gotten waxed in the suburbs. And you know, they're giving up whole areas of the state now. And you know, Craig and I disagree. I think that this is becoming a more competitive presidential state heading into 2016. You just can't give up broad swaths of the state in congressional elections time after time and expect to then compete as you once did. So I think they have a lot of work to do.
And you say that you disagree. You don't see any fundamental change.
No, I think they do have work to do, and I think they not only got waxed with suburban voters, they got waxed with rural voters. But I do think that the flip side of that is that the Republican Party has its own challenges when it comes to the presidential electorates. I mean, they are just have no foothold in urban areas and populous areas, in places where Democrats are able to run up giant margins and have been able to run up giant margins in presidential elections. So I think it'll be one of the interesting things to watch over the next couple of years is whether the Republican Party can find a way to sort of broaden its demographic coalition in a way that makes it more competitive in presidential cycles, and I think that remains to be seen.
Is there any region of the state that's in flux? We know about the suburbs, we know about Milwaukee. Is there any, like Brown County?
Sure. I mean, the Fox Valley has been a place that has voted both ways, and obviously voted more as a swing area in presidential races and more as a Republican kind of base area almost in these gubernatorial races. But it's gone, you know, it's a place where Democrats, under the right circumstances, have been able to compete. Western Wisconsin is a little bit more Democratic leaning, but the same thing. It's been a swing area in the Walker elections and more of a Democratic area at the presidential level.
The next question from James. Does all the coverage of polling actually influence voters and persuade supporters of those who are behind in the polls to stay home?
I am skeptical, and I think people have wondered that for a long time. I mean, there's no way to really answer that question, but I don't think polls drive voters. I think they sort of reflect public opinion, not.
I mean, that's the intent, but sometimes it might solidify. Well, in this case, we had the big Marquette poll where Charles Taylor, Charles Franklin, I'm sorry, was saying, everybody was saying it was neck and neck. Every poll, in fact, said it was neck and neck, except for his, which showed that Walker was up 7 among likely voters. Both sides, Democrats and Republicans, when that came out, said, we don't believe that. That's not true. A couple of days later, the Republicans said that they started seeing a trend and a break in their direction. And part of the reason for that, they said, was the heavy coverage of the Marquette poll. But you're dubious.
I am, and it's sort of a chicken or egg thing, because the reason Walker was ahead in the Marquette poll was it was reflecting greater intensity among Republican voters than Democratic voters. And so I don't think that intensity was a creation of the poll. I think it's a double-edged sword. I mean, if you're ahead, you know, Scott Walker was running around telling his base that it was a neck-and-neck race because he wanted people to be motivated and not complacent. So when you're ahead in a poll or behind in a poll, it can work in both directions.
You know, it was interesting because the Republicans in early September, you know, they were kind of on edge trying to figure this thing out, and they had to gin up their base. I mean, because there was complacency was setting in. So those neck and neck polls, you know, helped drive home the message that, you know, this is a real race. But then at the end, that poll with 6 days to go, I thought, boom, you could hear the air coming right out of the Democrats after that poll.
So what do you make of all the other polls? The ones that showed it was tied or as 1 percentage point, the PPP poll on the final weekend saying that Walker was up 1. Were they all just mistaken? Or
no, I mean, Marquette's own poll 2 weeks earlier had it at a deadlocked race. I mean, one of the things that was going on in this race is that if you take the broader population of the entire electorate, all registered voters, it hasn't changed that much, and it's been more competitive. It's when you get to the question of who's actually going to vote that Scott Walker's real advantage emerges. And so that's why you were seeing a lot more volatility among the likely voters than you were among all voters.
And they were all trying to figure out how many people were going to vote. It ended up being a shade under 2.4 million. Obviously, if it had been up to maybe 2.6 million advantage Democrats.
Right. Although actually, even though it wasn't maybe enough for Democrats, it was the biggest turnout we've had in a midterm election in Wisconsin in at least 60 years. At least, you know, in anybody's memory. It was a really spectacular turnout, and it may end up being the biggest turnout in the country in this election.
It's amazing how politically polarized the state is, and it sort of drives up that turnout.
Mm-hmm.
we have a question from Doobie, who says, seems to me that even though we all talk a good game about coming together, the public really doesn't want to come together. Isn't that the real lesson of these midterms? We have big disagreements, fundamental disagreements in Wisconsin, which you've been trying to say about that. Actually, is anyone talking about coming together?
No, no. The two sides, no, they're not. The two sides.
Well, they are. They're talking about coming together on their own terms.
On
though.
their own
Right.
terms. I mean, and Republicans will say, well, you know, we hope Democrats reach out to us, and Democrats will say, we hope Republicans reach out to us. But, I mean, you have basically a 52-47 electorate, but you're going to get a 100% Republican legislative program. And, you know, that's going to I don't think it'll cause upheaval, but, you know, there are going to be probably 47% of the public is not going to be happy.
You know, it's interesting. There are some issues where there's a lot of overlap. I mean, if you look at the exit polls, a large minority of Scott Walker voters, for example, favor raising the minimum wage. And if you look at some of the pre-election polls, you know, there are a lot of Democrats that favor photo ID. There are things that both parties do that draw support from the other party. The problem is when you have one-party government, they really don't have any incentive to reach out to the other side and compromise.
And where do you think this, you know, there is no loyal opposition when the loyal opposition can get rolled like the Democrats. So where is the opposition going to be?
I think that there will be, as there has been before, divisions within the own party. Both, you know, how far do you want to push things? Remember, Scott Walker said when he was first elected, he wanted all of the focus to be on economic issues, but then there were abortion bills and those things. So you have individual members of the legislature who have their own agendas. So plus, it doesn't have to be just ideological. I think there are differences in terms of personalities. Robin Voss is a bigger personality, and he wants to see his version of things go through. So I think that's something to watch, is the tension between Scott Walker and Robin Voss.
Well, plus you've got Scott Walker and the whole question of his presidential ambitions. And so, you know, he may have interests that the Republican legislature doesn't necessarily share when it comes to how things affect his own potential presidential race.
So when Scott Walker was here for the edit board, he said that if Paul Ryan ran, he all but said he would not run. First of all, do you believe that?
Well, I think what he was saying was if Paul Ryan is unambiguously in the race, when it comes time for him to make a decision, he won't get in, but that's probably not the way it's going to play out. I mean, one of them is they're both going to sort of test the waters, possibly, and so I don't think it's going to be a clear-cut situation. I think most people think that he is clearly eager to run, and there's more of a question about what Paul Ryan really wants.
Did you
to do.
read much into his speech last night with all of the references to Washington, America, and those sorts of things?
He truly nationalized the race in the last 10 days. I was listening to him on the campaign trail, and you know, he was talking about more and more about Washington's special interests and standing up to them. And if you can do that in Wisconsin, you can do it in other states. You can do it around the country. Yeah,
the Waterloo reference, that this was the Waterloo for the opposition here.
So he was very effective on the stump in those last 10 days, really driving home his message and making it not just a statewide message, but a national message that I'm sure resonated with parts of the Republican establishment around the country.
Why do you think this time Paul Ryan's, I mean, he got in and he ends up winning by 30 points this time. Last time, I think it was 12 points. What's the difference? Why did he pick up so many more?
So the big difference is last time, it was a presidential electorate, so it was a more Democratic group of voters.
Right.
And also he was on the ticket, so he became a more polarizing figure by being on the ticket. I mean, he was getting crossover voters. He was getting some Democrats and a lot of independents and moderates to vote for him in his district because he hadn't been defined by sort of the war between the parties nationally. And so I think that was one reason why it was his closest re-election really ever in the last cycle, and why he won by more this time.
You know, he's done a lot of interesting things. I mean, every few months he's issuing a big policy speech. So, you know, he sort of inches up. You think he's going to run for president, and then he sort of backs off. I can't figure it out. One day I think he's definitely running, and the next day I think maybe not. Maybe he's waiting.
You and I have had that discussion before, where he was here for an edit board, and he was talking all numbers and the minutia of policy and so forth, and then you walk out and you say he's not going to run, but now, you
Well,
know,
two differences with Governor Walker is Paul Ryan has really pretty young kids.
Right.
And so he's got a slightly different family situation. And he's also about to seek the chairmanship of the House Ways and Means Committee, which is a hugely powerful position in Congress, and it's kind of been his dream job for a long time. So he has a big pull when it comes to continuing his sort of House career that's significant. I mean, it's sort of there's a trade-off there if you run for president.
do you see any scenario in which the Walker and Ryan are both running for president simultaneously?
I mean, I just can't see it.
I can't see it
it's,
either.
It's politics. Anything is possible, but it's hard for me to imagine.
If Walker gets in the next 3 months, and as you said, it's going to take Paul Ryan a little bit of time to solidify and to get that position at the Ways and Means, that gives Walker several months in which he can toy around with this idea, start talking it up.
I mean, but he's also, you know, I think he has to think about having just come off of a re-election campaign for governor, and I think it's going to, you know, the optics of turning around immediately and running for president are not great. Now, maybe that's a price he's happy to pay, but I mean, the presidential election is sort of beginning any moment now.
I'm getting way ahead of things, but does Ryan or Walker offer something to the Republican Party in terms of being able to expand its base? Have you seen anything by either candidate that says, if this person runs, we'll be able to reach out further and be able to?
Well, Ryan has this dimension where he's spent a lot of time talking about poverty. He's got very conservative arguments to make, but arguments to make about income, mobility, about issues that Republicans necessarily haven't been talking as much about. So I think he sees himself as somebody who can bridge some of those divisions. Governor Walker is coming out of this very polarizing environment in Washington where he's been seen as a more divisive candidate, and it's sort of up to him to try to transcend that a little bit.
So that'll be his next step. So the next question is from Mary. She asks, do you think the war on women was overused during this election?
I don't think actually in Wisconsin, you know, there was the commercials for the war on women, you know, but the candidates themselves, I'm talking about Mary Burke, and to a lesser extent Susan Happ, really didn't bring it up that much. I mean, they sort of, I guess by being women candidates, that was going to be enough. But I think that was an issue that played out in other races around the state. I'm thinking Colorado, the Senate race, far more than it did here.
But for whatever reason, if you believe the exit polls, we had a bigger gender gap this time than Scott Walker's first two elections. I mean, he won men by a staggering amount. I think 21 points, something like that. And obviously, Democrats can't compete in an election in which they're losing men by more than 20 points. At the same time, Scott Walker lost women by a bigger margin than he lost them in his first two victories. So the gender lines were deeper, whether it was because he was running against a woman candidate, or because of some of the social issues, or other reasons. I don't know.
This is a question from Joe. Hypothetical, if every single person in Wisconsin who cared about had voted yesterday, who would have won between Walker and Burke? And this is, in other words, how important was turnout in a race like this?
Well, turnout does matter, did matter. I mean, one of the secrets to Governor Walker's success politically in Wisconsin is having a political base that's both really, really motivated and really, really loyal. So they are turning out and they are voting almost without exception for him. That's hard to compete with. And so if you took every single eligible voter in the state of Wisconsin, I don't know what the outcome would have been. I think we can say with a lot of confidence it would have been closer. Who
are those people who don't vote in the midterms but do vote in the presidential? Who exactly, what do we know about them?
So we know that they are more Democratic leaning than the people that vote all the time.
Yeah,
and they tend to be demographically, they tend to be more mobile, they tend to be younger, lower income. In some cases, minority voters, but that, the minority turnouts in Wisconsin have actually been pretty decent compared to white turnout in recent elections, at least in presidential races, but there is a fall off. I mean, there was a huge difference between the turnout in the city of Milwaukee in 2010 and 2012, and bigger than in most places.
The next question from Charlie. I've heard little to nothing on the referendum. So what passed and what didn't pass? I'm just going to focus on two of those. The one that passed and is actually was a constitutional amendment and matters is the one with the roads, setting up a special fund for roads that can't be tapped as they were under Doyle.
I love road builders having their own constitutional amendment. It's awesome, actually.
Do you read anything into that? Why that passed? That the vote was 80-20. It wasn't even close.
That was
and I think it won every county in the state.
That's a bipartisan thing. I mean, you know, that's the one issue that both Walker and Burke agreed on. People just want that money, that transportation money, to stay in that pot. They don't want the transportation fund to be quote unquote raided.
Well, I put out the issue last night and said who were the winners or losers, and a number of labor types sent me notes saying you've got to say the minimum wage was the winner because it passed 60-40, was it? It was around 60-40?
Yeah, I mean, the electorate that voted on Tuesday decisively supported raising the minimum wage, and we've seen that in the opinion polls, the pre-election opinion polls too.
But what does it matter to have a symbolic vote? I mean, you know, if you're labor,
it makes you feel good,
I guess. But I mean, if you're labor, you've been annihilated at the polls on, you know, on the candidates you feel that you want, and you win a symbolic vote with no hope of getting this through the legislature. So I understand the great passion of raising the minimum wage to $10.10 an hour. But you know, if you don't have political power, it's just all smoke and mirrors.
So the bottom line, it would be, is there going to be any change in the minimum wage here in the state? Do you see that as a result of this vote?
I haven't heard the Republicans talking about a change in the minimum wage. Wouldn't that be a shocker, though?
Well, the governor. What did the governor tell us at the edit board, though, about his views on the minimum wage?
His views on the minimum wage is that, you know, he wants to talk about the higher wage, and he doesn't see, I don't want to misquote him about that, but he didn't see how it mattered as much. So
he said it didn't serve a purpose. That's a little bit more. I don't see this being on his agenda at all.
No, I don't either.
But it is an issue, as you said, where some of his supporters favor that.
True.
It's also a bizarre thing that in the exit polls, you had a large majority of people saying that they favored an increase in the minimum wage, but you also had a majority of people saying that they thought government shouldn't be intervening in all of these different areas,
right,
where businesses should be doing their own thing and individuals doing it. So how do you put all of those things together?
Well, some of these lines get pretty blurry, and you've got, you know, on the conservative side, you've got social conservatives, you've got economic conservatives and populists, and so all the issue lines and issue debates aren't always super clean and super sharp in these races.
Well, that's the drug testing for recipients of, of public benefits. Very popular polling, both among, definitely among Republicans, and also some support among Democrats. That's another one of those 60-40 issues that seem to cross party lines.
So our last question today comes from Crabby Old Man. He wants to know, what was more boring, election night or the James Taylor concert? Any guesses? We all missed the James Taylor concert.
Well, we know that the James Taylor concert went longer than the election night.
And how long did it take last night to call the race?
I think this was over 90 minutes.
Yeah, I think, yeah.
I don't think it was, I mean, election nights are not boring to me. There were a lot of, you know, you look around the country, there were a lot of really close races. We had a tide and a wave, but we didn't know what would happen going in. I thought it was a pretty interesting night.
And actually, it wasn't even a short night because there were some assembly races,
right,
Senate races that stayed in the balance for a long time. We obviously have what's the status in the Assembly and the Senate?
I think there's 63 Republicans in the Assembly, and I believe it's 19 in the Senate. And that's probably why you're going to see leadership change among the Democrats, because they have just
in both houses?
I think you're probably looking at it in both houses, or a possibility of change in both houses. I mean, they are now in worse shape now than they were in 2010.
Well, thanks for joining us today. That was our last question. I'm going to stick around and answer a few of these questions online. So if you have questions, go ahead and keep on sending them to us, and we'll answer those then. Thank you.